Okay, guys, we are going to add to our notes that we've been taking over short stories. And today we're going to talk a little bit about conflict. So, one thing I do want to show you is on the notes. So, there are guided notes for you. Um, they look like a PowerPoint like this. Okay. So, as you're going along, I have this. You can go to, excuse me, you can go to view and zoom. That's what I did. So originally it was in fit, which it looked like this, which is super small for filling them in, I think. So if you just go up here and you go to view and you go to zoom and go to 100%, then you can follow along with the notes, and everywhere that it says type here, you just go up there and it's a text box. Okay, so then you can add your um, in your notes as we go through them. Okay, so there's 3 pages of notes about conflict. So back to the presentation. So we've already talked about conflict just a little bit, and conflict is basically the struggle between two opposing forces. Super important that you remember that it's forces, because it's not always a person versus person type of situation. So some examples are in the Hunger Games, Katniss fights against the Capitol, and then she also has a conflict of deciding which guy she likes better, Gale or Peeta. So we will look at those two types of conflicts and how to classify those. Okay, so a conflict is the driving force in any story, either fiction or nonfiction. Okay, so even if you're reading a nonfiction story about the war, any war, you're going to have conflicts clearly. Okay, and then in the fiction, we just got done working on plot diagrams, and that initial conflict is what begins that rising action and helps build tension as you move up towards the climax. It makes the story exciting, and it keeps us wondering what's going to happen next and what's going to happen with this character. It's how the characters deal with this conflict that reveals their character traits or their characterization. We get an idea of what kind of person they are based on how they deal with these conflicts. So, like, for example, if we go back to Rikki Tikki Tavi, one of the conflicts was the cobras that were living in the garden, in that they were eating the eggs, and then they were trying to, Nag had snuck in through the drain, and he was attempting to kill the family that lived in the house. So there were two characters, and one of the questions that we asked on those comprehension questions was whose approach to life, Darzee or Rikki Tikki's, was more effective. And a lot of people said Rikki Tikki because he took care of business and took things head on. So this would be an example of how a character deals with conflict, shows you about their character traits. So a lot of people said that he was brave or courageous because he was willing to take on these cobras knowing that he would possibly die. All right, we talked about this before. Protagonist and antagonist. Protagonist is your main character. Usually it's the hero, it's the person that you're going for, that you're rooting for. The conflict revolves around this character, and whatever choices they make determines how the conflict will continue or how it will be resolved. The protagonist often has multiple conflicts during a story, so they might be having something like, if we go back to Rikki Tikki Tavi that we just read last week, obviously it was Rikki Tikki versus the Cobras, but then he was also having a conflict with himself when he was trying to kind of hype himself up when he went into fight with Nag. He knew that it was dangerous and that if he didn't get Nag right in the right correct spot, that he was going to be killed. Or when he goes down into the hole with Nagana, he had kind of this, obviously it was Rikki Tikki versus Nagana, but also probably some concerns about whether he was going to make it out alive. Okay, so that's the protagonist. The antagonist is the force, whatever the force is that the protagonist is up against. The antagonist can take lots of forms, but most often we associate it with another character. And we will get into these different types of conflict here in just a minute. It could, however, be something that's intangible, such as fear. So intangible, something that you can't touch. So fear is something that you can't touch, and that could be the antagonist in a story. So you have two types of conflict. One of them is an external conflict, and the other is an internal conflict. With an external conflict, a character goes against something that's outside of their control. It's another person, or maybe nature or society. Okay, an internal conflict is within themselves. It's like the devil and the angel on your shoulder battling it out. And it's this, Ricky Tikki trying to decide if he should be brave and take on the cobras, or if he should just, not fight with them because it was so dangerous. All right, so an internal conflict, person versus self. This is where the character has this indecision or conflicting feelings within themselves. So maybe it's a confidence issue, like they might be lacking confidence to do something that they want to do, like ask somebody out or try out for the varsity football team or whatever. Sometimes the character is trying to make a moral decision between right and wrong, or sometimes it's like a mental health thing. So maybe the person is fighting with depression or anxiety, and they're having this internal conflict. Or it could be desires. Maybe a person wants power, or they want to be liked by someone, those types of things. So internal conflicts. External is, again, something outside of their control. So these are the different types. You have person versus person versus nature, person versus supernatural, person versus technology, and person versus society. Person versus person. This is probably the most common. It's just what it is. The character goes against another character. Sometimes it's a physical battle, like the Avengers versus Thanos. Or sometimes it might be a power struggle, like Mufasa and Scar. Yes, they get into a physical altercation at the end, or with the stampede, but they both desire the kingdom. And that's what it is. It's a power struggle. Or sometimes a psychological battle, like in Romeo and Juliet, which you haven't read. I don't think so yet. But in that, they have these two families that are fighting against each other. You can probably think of lots of other examples from either movies or books that you have read. Okay, so person versus person. Then you have person versus nature. Okay, an example of that right now would be in like in Colorado with the wildfires. That would be a timely example of person versus nature. So it can be the weather, rain, wind, etc. It could be a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado or a forest fire, okay, a snowstorm, or it could be versus the wilderness. There's a really, really good, well, it's a really good movie, but it's also a good book. It's called Into the Wild, and it's about this guy who basically leaves everything behind and goes out to live in the middle of Alaska. And he's all by himself, and he's learning how to survive all by himself out in the wilderness. And spoiler alert, in the end, he eats a berry that he shouldn't have eaten because it's poisonous. All right, then you also have person versus supernatural. Okay, so this is a character versus a supernatural force, maybe against fate, or maybe it could be like magical forces or deities like gods like Percy Jackson, for example. A series like that, like the Rick Riordan books, okay? Harry Potter, zombies and aliens, maybe a religious experience, or trying to overcome fate. Could be like that book. This is from quite a while ago, so I don't know if you remember this book, but Heaven is for Real. When the little boy is having surgery and he passes away. So that could be an example. Or a character trying to overcome fate. Adventures of Ulysses. He goes on these adventures and he has to fight all these different forces out there. There's like siren sisters that like lure him in and all these things. So that would be like person versus supernatural. Person versus technology. It's exactly what it sounds like. Struggling against some type of technology. Could be fighting against a machine. This is pretty popular in movies to have technology controlling people or robots, different things like that. Oftentimes, when you see a person versus technology, the technology makes the character question what makes them human and different from the machines. Lastly, we have person versus society. This is when they're in opposition to society, the government, a cultural tradition, or a societal norm. Okay, Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus Finch stands up to society by defeating Tom Robinson, who's a black man. A character goes against something that they see as morally right or wrong within their society. Characters might go against it as a desire for happiness, freedom, justice, or love. So, different groups like Martin Luther King, when they were marching for civil rights, that was an example of man versus society. Okay. Those are the basic types. We have internal struggles and external struggles. And the external struggles, there's those 5 different types: man versus nature, man versus society, man versus technology, and then you have the internal conflict of man versus self, man versus nature. Did I say that? I don't remember. Okay, and then, so that's on your notes. So hopefully you do fill in these notes because you're going to want these. We will have a test over this information in the next couple weeks. So you definitely are going to want this stuff to study from. Okay. All right. If you have any questions, we do have a Zoom Q&A drop-in time today that is at 12:10 until 12:30. And you can just pop in and ask any questions that you have about either assignments or whatever the case may be. Okay, thanks.